All right. Well, nice to meet you. Obviously read and know about you over the years, and so it's good to finally meet. I think we may have talked on the phone though, you and I
We
have
did,
at some
yeah.
point. Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Well, great to talk to you, and thank you for making the time. Um, did Rachel, do you want to jump in? I can start or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, great to see you again, Neşe. Thank you so much for making time to speak with us. Yeah, I think if you just want to jump in, Andrew, that would be great.
All right. Um, I mean, how in general would we're writing for a general audience. How would you sort of describe Symposia's role kind of in the, you know, in the psychedelic community? What are you guys trying to do? And a follow-up to that is like what in your mind is kind of the ideal role that psychedelics, should play in society, or at least here in the US.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think it might be helpful just to explain first that Symposia is essentially a pro-psychedelic think tank and advocacy nonprofit for the psychedelic industry. And we are ultimately looking and focused beyond the psychedelic community on public health as a whole, at a time when psychedelics are becoming increasingly mainstreamed and normalized. There's a big disconnect between the media narratives about psychedelics and psychedelic therapy and what the actual evidence shows. And as more and more people are seeking out psychedelic access, there's more and more risk of things going wrong. And so we have been focused recently on that harm reduction orientation, but I got into the field myself because of experiencing life-changing healing firsthand from psychedelics. And so that is where we are kind of fundamentally coming from, is knowing there is a great potential for benefit, but there's also a great risk of harm.
Yeah. Can you talk about sort of how, I mean, you're pro psychedelics, but how do you sort of envision their role, like the ideal role they'll play in society in terms from a regulatory standpoint, even commercialization. I know some of the feelings on that, but yeah, how would you kind of what would it look like? What would that ideal world look like where psychedelics do play a healthy role in, healing?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I at Johns Hopkins, I'm full-time salaried at Johns Hopkins. That's my primary focus. And in my work at Hopkins, I work in harm reduction beyond just psychedelics, and I take a similar answer and stance on this question outside just thinking about the war on drugs in general. I think that we need to undo that and move in a decriminalization direction combined with harm reduction education and benefit maximization education for a range of drugs. I'm, for example, very much in favor of safe supply. People shouldn't be dying because their drug supply is poisoned. There's a line that some people say, like every overdose is a policy failure. I think that we need to do a lot better for people and for especially the most vulnerable groups in society. So, with that as like a general answer, I would say I'm very open to the possibility that medical uses of psychedelics might prove to be safe and effective and beneficial for specific demographics and cases. And in under those conditions, it makes sense for those to move through the FDA process separate from a general kind of decrim model. But if psychedelics are being presented as medicines, I think that they need to pass the highest standards of scientific and ethical rigor in order to get there. And we can't be rushing things out of a sense of urgency when the demographics that are being potentially introduced to these substances are some of the most vulnerable, multiply traumatized groups in society that don't have a lot of options or safety nets if things go wrong. The stakes are very high. And because of that, I think it's important to move slowly and make sure that we've gotten things right before introducing people to these sorts of medicines in a medical context specifically.
Um, Rachel, did you want to jump in and ask anything related to
Um,
that?
I think I'm good so far. I can take things in a different direction, but is there anything else you wanted to ask along those lines, Andrew?
Um, well, maybe we could just talk a bit about sort of the shift to the MDMA therapy. And if you could talk maybe a little bit about how you guys feel the role you played in that process, starting out even long before the hearings began, and with the ICER report, leading up to FDA, the adcoms, and then to the decision. I mean, how do you see the role you played there?
Yeah, well, so I was involved back in 2021 I was like a co-author, co-signatory of a complaint or a letter that was sent in to the FDA where we urged the FDA to investigate some of the issues that eventually did become public during first the ICER report and then the AdCom. And we were making the case, one of the co-signatories of that letter had presented evidence that and made the case to the FDA that there was a connection between the phase 2 on-camera sexual assault that had occurred in the previous, MDMA trial and the therapy model in particular, and urged there to be an investigation. That full investigation never happened back then. I heard that there was some auditing of MAPS trial sites, but no one reached out from the FDA to that phase 2 participant to get an account and to really vet whether that might be the case, that maybe this was not a fluke aberration that could not have been prevented and a statistical inevitability of, anyone in a position of power is potentially vulnerable, like any area of medicine, which is something that MAPS was really leaning into. And because of that, by the time 2024 rolled around, we were already years in my case, research, because I'm a ethics researcher and writer at Johns Hopkins. I had been researching the therapy model and its origins in the underground, the illicit underground. And we'd also been, meeting, talking to people who had been harmed by people who were trained by MAPS therapists. So this was like very far into our work and our concern in this area by the time we got to the AdCom. I should mention that there's been a lot of false narratives implying that all of the people who were opposed to Lykos's new drug application were working in concert, which was not the case. So I can say that from my side, I and my current Psymposia colleagues, none of us had anything to do with the ICER draft. We found out about the draft the same time the rest of the field found out about it, and we were very surprised. We had been trying to raise concerns about some of the issues that were raised in that draft for a long time, but had not actually gotten a lot of validation or, response of other people that were sufficiently concerned from our perspective, given the stakes of the issues that we identified. So we were glad that someone else who was not Psymposia was actually raising these issues that we've been trying to draw attention to. My only role in the ICER process, was responding to the public comment, which any member of the public was able to do to come and speak at the meeting that they held. And I also served as an official support for one of the participants who also spoke during that meeting. But that was the extent of my involvement in ICER. And then did you want to hear about the AdCom as well?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I know, certainly know much about your role, but yeah, anything you want to tell me, but also just did you feel like you guys had an impact in that process? I mean, was it impactful?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the background, I've actually thought it was a little bit odd that there were so many narratives, some of which were, funded and amplified by the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative, which has been instrumental to completing the clinical trials on MDMA. There was so much narrative about our role and involvement, and no one has really reached out to ask, like, what did you do, or how did you do it, and what was your plan? Like that there hasn't been much interest in that, which I found very strange. That, you know, there was just a lot of circulation of assumptions and narratives without actually like checking in about what happened. But the reason we had an impact, we did have some impact. I would say we're not responsible for the decision. The way that I have like thought of that, and I should kind of step back for a second and say there's no way to know for sure what the factors were in the ultimate decision, because Lycos has chosen not to release the complete response letter. So, you know, people can speculate about the relative influence of different factors, but it's not actually possible for me or anyone besides Lycos to say what factors made the ultimate decision. But I kind of think of like what we did as bringing kind of we helped make people aware that this was happening, that there was an opportunity for the public to come and share their perspectives. Not all of the critical perspectives were part of Psymposia. Not all of them were people that we kind of invited or shared information about how to apply. There are people who I heard of for the first time who had a critical perspective who were at that meeting as everyone else was hearing it. So it's not true that we were like controlling everything behind the scenes. What we did do is Psymposia alerted I think a lot of people heard about the AdCom for the first time because of the citizen petition that I and Brian Peace of Psymposia were both involved with. That was not a Psymposia project, so that was two of us were involved in it. I had the idea for it after speaking to whistleblowers involved in who were former employees who had told me there was supposed to be an advisory committee meeting, and they had seen a lot of very concerning things that they were worried about whether it would. They felt a conflict about feeling like the application was not truthful about everything that had happened, did not accurately reflect the trials that had happened to an extent that jeopardized public health. And people were coming to me from the company and also former trial participants and also private clients of MAPS therapists who were doing MAPS therapy with things like ketamine or underground MDMA. And so I was hearing all of this information about things that corroborated the concerns in the ICER report, but were not public. And so for 3 days after I spoke to one of the whistleblowers, I felt I was sitting with like so much intensity and just like pressure, because people were coming to me saying they were afraid of coming forward. They felt morally obligated to say something, but they were afraid of coming forward because they were worried they were going to be targeted and that they would be blamed and they would be scapegoated. And so I intentionally thought to myself, okay, I have my first stable job in my life after 10 years on the academic job market. I am in a good position. I've been through some things in the psychedelic field that I understand how things can go very sideways and how awful that can be. And I was like, I can kind of take this on as a proxy for many other perspectives that felt like they were too vulnerable for different reasons to come forward. And I suddenly thought about, I kind of heard that line ringing in my head that there's supposed to be an advisory committee meeting. Maybe that could be a place where some of these concerns could be raised. And I'm a writer. I was actually teaching writing policy memos at the time to students at Johns Hopkins. And I was teaching them how to write recommendations and make the case for something, ask the government to act. And I thought about it, like, what if we try to write a citizen petition? What if we try to ask the FDA to extend the open public hearing? I looked at it wasn't even something that I know how I found out, because I read the regulations, the federal law about the AdCom, and I found a small section talking about the open public hearing. And it said, generally it has to be, an hour, but the chair has the discretion to extend it. And so I made the case, and working with a few other authors, made the case that should be extended to be able to hear more of the non-sponsor perspectives. And this reflects, I have found out a lot about FDA going through this process. it reflects a broader issue that in recent years, the FDA has become very deferential to the sponsor, to the fact that, to the point that like and the EPA is like this as well with chemical manufacturers, where they kind of have become as if they are working, like the clients are the sponsors. And it's actually kind of like deferential to the sponsor's narrative. So I really wanted to encourage them to make a space for the public to come forward with information that would be important to consider the application. So we did get a formal response from the FDA. They granted our request to extend the open public hearing. And then we did encourage, kind of make accessible, this is how you apply to present, this is the form, this is the formatting, and tried to kind of democratically make this participation more accessible in a way that parallels what's going on right now with SSDP and the DEA, where it's, you know, concerned citizens, researchers who are coming forward and participating in the democratic process of our government and how it's functioning. So kind of extending from book research to how does this interface with the world in order to kind of think about intervening and changing the way that things are going. So it was not a conspiracy. There was no kind of like, we even put out a press release ahead of time saying that we were going to be participating. We were very kind of like open about that. And just as the last comment, I ultimately did not expect to have the kind of impact we did. You could tell we had an impact because when the committee returned from the open public hearing, the tone, the mood of the room shifted in a way that paralleled what had happened at the ICER meeting the week before, where you could like feel a needle drop. Like it was this kind of, we clearly were heard and we were taken seriously. So I don't think, you know, if Lycos had been dotting their I's and crossing their T's and there weren't all these other problems, it wouldn't have mattered what we did. But the fact of the matter, there were too many problems. At both the ICER meeting and the AdCom, someone after the open hearings said the same comment in different words, but the idea was that any one of these problems, like the blinding, we could come up with kind of an explanation for, but there's too many problems to confidently say this is ready for prime time. And I think that we helped indicate that there really needed to be more of an investigation into the data that was submitted as part of the NDA.
So it's fair to say you're pleased then, you're pleased with the outcome.
Well, I think it was the right outcome for public health. I think the stakes were extremely high. PTSD population in this country, a lot of folks are very impoverished, don't have a lot of resources. They're people that, like some of the people I speak to, have been very harmed by the trial, and to the point that their life got put on hold afterwards, where it's like the trial never ended for them. And the people who, they don't have resources to help put things back together. They find people like me to try to get help, to try to share what happened, that they didn't match up with the narrative and the hype in the media. And then when I try to come forward and say, I think there's something here that we need to look at more carefully and be sure that we're doing this in the right way, then I get attacked, then I get death threats. And it's a signal that there's something going on in this field that is not rooted in concern for the most marginalized patients who are going to be seeking this out. And I think, you know, if the field were to take a different orientation and see critics as an important source of information and people who have a different perspective on things, that we could be seen, instead of a threat to the field, as a benefit of value of how can we do things safer. Because ultimately, I believe that what we did was in the interest of the long-term longevity of the field. Because if this had moved forward and the predictable patterns of harm that I have been articulating in my research played out on a much larger scale, there could have been the same backlash that we saw with opioids, where opioids are a very powerful, important medicine for people with extreme pain. But when there was a backlash after predictable patterns of harm happened post OxyContin approval, then there was a swing in the other direction. It became very hard for people, even people who needed OxyContin to live, to actually access that medicine. So I think in the long run, it makes sense to be sure and to make sure that all of the concerns have been looked into and properly investigated. And the fact that the patient advocates, whistleblowers, ethics researchers are receiving death threats and retaliation should be a signal that there's something going on here that doesn't quite make sense.
Hmm. I know I'm hogging the questions here, Rachel.
Yeah.
Well, but just
No worries.
one last question. Do you think this another clinical trial, that the FDA has asked Lykos, do you think that'll do the trick in your mind? Do you think and one more clinical trial can address the concerns and without, I mean, obviously you've got to see the results, but hopefully they would address the concerns. Are you ready to sort of throw your full support behind this Lykos now that they're doing another clinical trial?
Well, I would just say again, I really think if Lykos wants to do things in a better way, I would encourage them to be transparent about the complete response letter and actually what went into the decision in the first place, and then what they're changing. Because ultimately, if they do things like ensure that the therapy is not grounded in pseudoscience, which was the case in my research, I argue, from the original MDMA-assisted therapy, that it was actually not empirically justified and was associated with a predictable pattern of harms in the underground where the model came from. If they actually, change that element. And also another big issue was that many of the people that they hired were these boutique kind of mom and pop non-research trial sites that didn't have backgrounds in research, which includes things like how to mitigate bias and how to kind of do all the documentation of research and make sure that you're kind of attentive to the ethical concerns. A lot of people were just therapists who had extensive experience in some cases in the underground, who were trained in the underground. And that was intentional from everything I've seen in terms of Rick Doblin's decisions of who he was choosing to be on those trial sites. So, if they're able to actually do the research to the highest standards of, evidence gathering and transparency and disclosure of what they're actually doing, I think that puts them on a good footing. But until I know the full details of what their new trials are planning, I feel like I have to kind of withhold my ultimate judgment on that.
Do you have any specific next steps yourself with regard to just like keeping tabs on what's happening or anything like that moving forward?
So I think that, part of how I got here personally is like I was not trying to be a critical voice. I was personally sexually assaulted in the underground on MDMA with a trusted mentor who told me that it was for me, that he did that to me, that it wasn't sexual, that it was for my healing, that he intuited that that's what I needed to heal, who told me that when I resisted and said that was wrong, that it showed that I wasn't as much of an expert in psychedelics as he thought. I have gotten to this point because of what I have seen and what I have been through. And one of the things that I have learned over these years is that the dominant model of underground psychedelic therapy is, I believe, fundamentally dangerous and flawed. And there are other ways that we can think about what psychedelics do and how they work and how we are talking about them. But this field is not democratically built. The version of the field that we saw leading up to the Lykos decision, many people were conditioned to feel, even people who saw red flags with the ways that MAPS was running its trials, they were conditioned, if not explicitly told, that they needed to kind of look the other way and identify with success of MAPS in order for the whole field to stand up and change the world in the future. And a lot of the people who were critical scholars and voices got pushed out. And the people who were amplified, in part because of the role of PSFC, the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative, were people who were deferential to this underground model and were seeking to normalize it. It's been the dominant model in the States They're trying to, the same flaws that I was identifying in the MAPS clinical trials are being codified in the laws in some of these state, Oregon, Colorado, and I'm sure they would be trying to do the same thing in Massachusetts if it were to get approved. But there are groups like the Gatherwell consciousness medicine lineage associated with Francoise Borzat and Aharon Grossbard, who they have predictable patterns of harm. Ethicists have referred to it as a virus, where people who are trained into this model go on to train people with a predictable pattern of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and assault associated with it. And that lineage, that underground school that has had to change its name to Gatherwell because of how widespread the assaults were. Now in Colorado, if you're trained in that school, you can get an expedited pipeline with 5 days of additional in-person training, and you will be licensed by the state of Colorado to work with the most vulnerable people who are desperate to heal. And so my work in the immediate future is trying to educate people about what this underground model actually entailed. And I have been going to psychedelic conferences, ethics conferences, and when I'm able to explain that this model is premised on a flawed assumption that therapists can intuitively, telepathically discern by attuning to the relational field, they can tap into what their client needs and read that and determine when encouraging them to play out traumatic events in the room by standing in, playing the role of the perpetrator. That is a fundamentally dangerous assumption. And it is, in my research, I'm arguing that is actually leading people, that underlying premise is leading people to mistake their own unconscious drives and assumptions and project them onto the clients who are in very highly vulnerable, suggestible states. And I think that is absolutely what happened in the phase 2 assault. I think it is a direct consequence of the therapy model. Richard Jensen, who was implicated in that, is one of the originators, one of the founding leaders of this therapy model. He was not just some unlicensed therapist. And I think that when you're training people, like as a side comment, like on Psychedelics Today, just to show you how widespread this is, there's 2 MAPS therapists talking. This is, I think it's from 2021, it's Veronica Gold and Harvey Schwartz. And they were talking about the fact that psychedelic therapists are going to retreats and discovering that they have telepathic powers, and then finding that when they're coming back to their colleagues in the kind of ordinary perspective on reality, no one understands them. And Harvey Schwartz was saying we need to support psychedelic therapists to understand that they're cultivating the spiritual capacity to actually read what their clients need. And I argue in my research that this is tapping into the same biased, flawed assumptions as facilitated communication, which I don't know if you've heard about that, but are either of you familiar with facilitated communication?
I'm not, no.
So there was a recent documentary on it because there was a professor, it was very much parallel psychedelics in the sense that it's tapping into this deep-seated desire to help clients. In this case, it's nonverbal, like autistic or other severely nonverbal clients, be able to finally communicate. So families are like, this is a dream come true. Facilitators who work with these clients are like, wow, we can actually, there's this locked in personality here this whole time that we're just helping. And the idea is it's facilitated communication because you're supporting the arm of the person to type out what they're thinking. And it's gotten to the point where people believe it feels so real that they're intuitively discerning what the other person's trying to say, that people have ended up sexually assaulting their clients when actually they found out it's purely ventriloquism. They've done blinded tests where they show different pictures to the client and the facilitator, and every time it's the facilitator describing what they're seeing. And the emphasis on touch, the emphasis on intuition in the MAPS therapy, all of these factors, the ideomotor effects that are like Ouija board effects come into play when you're touching someone, you feel like you're intuitively understanding what they need and want. And then the confirmation bias, where everything that's coming up is coming up for healing, and you're actually helping the client to like birth out their trauma imprints, which is this undisclosed component of the therapy model. It's leading people to project onto the clients in a way that will be disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable people in society, which is what happens in other areas of medicine. It's very common for white privileged doctors to think that, oh, Black folks, they don't feel pain as severely. They have thicker skin, and so they're less responsive to the pain signals of their Black clients. Same thing would have happened if this got out and went prime time. It would have been not the wealthy, new age clientele that is drawn to and like wanting this spiritual kind of context in their therapy. It would have been people, inner city Black Baltimore residents, who were just looking for PTSD healing, told that this was something that was, you know, gold standard, last resort, miraculous outcome. And they would have been subjected to a context where the therapists are taught that their biases, their readout of what that person is doing, whether they're resisting or whether they are participating, and whether when they need to be kind of like pushed in directions that are not in their consensual interests, are deserving of that being pushed in that direction. So I'm very confident in my research that the fact that there was so much of a pseudoscientific basis in the MAPS therapy meant that it was not safe to move out into the prime time for most people.
So one person that I've been in touch with, you mentioned Veronica Gold, and she's pushed back strongly against your representation of her in the AdCom and in some of your subsequent writings. I was just wondering if you've reached out to her at all just to get her direct take on her practices and how they've been represented.
I have not talked to Veronica Gold. I have not reached out to her. I'm not a journalist, is one thing. So I am a ethicist that works with narrative ethics, and I do textual analysis. And a lot of people have been saying that, oh, this was just a really gentle pushing that she was advocating for. But ultimately, she was working with clients in altered states, ketamine and MDMA. She has acknowledged on podcasts her clients lie down on a bed. And she was in a situation where describing in a textbook, so this is not just her memoir talking about her experiences, it's a textbook to teach best practices in psychedelic therapy, where she was teaching that you can rely on a safe word decided to in an ordinary state of consciousness to determine when a client in escalating distress over a period of minutes is really referring to "get your fucking hands off me" to the father in their head, and when it's the therapist. That is extremely dangerous. It is going to encourage people who are interacting with people who are having a panic attack to blame them for not remembering a safe word. And if you are actually regressed and freaking out and panicked, to think that a safe word is a responsible way of distinguishing when "get your fucking hands off me" means continue providing resistance while you're lying down on a table in an altered state, that is highly likely to lead to re-traumatization, especially for people who have trauma with their boundaries not being respected. I mean, it's like when I have described this premise of relying on a safe word, which is baked into the adherence manual of MAPS since at least 2013. So it is Veronica Gold, her CAP, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. That is from, like she said on multiple podcasts that they set that up so that they could start doing the MAPS therapy in already with ketamine. So there is a complete connection between her ketamine work and her MDMA work. And when I've talked to people who are clinicians who are not in the psychedelic field, and I've described the situation as objectively as I can, as neutrally as I can, is it safe under these conditions of an extreme power imbalance where people may be extremely dissociated and having a panic attack to say that the safe word, to use a safe word to determine when it's okay to continue applying resistance to someone who's lying down and saying, get your fucking hands off me. And people have said over and over again, no, that is not safe. The fact that it was taught as best practice should raise concerns about the attention to issues of power dynamics, suggestibility, panic that can potentially come into these settings. And one other thing about that is that she, in some of the responses I've gotten, people have said the client could have just withdrawn at any time. But that doesn't actually make sense if you read the passage, because Veronica Gold very clearly writes, because the safe word was not invoked, there was no doubt in my mind about how to proceed. So
Can I just jump in? I just want to clarify something. She was talking about ketamine, but you mentioned this at the AdComs hearing, right? But I don't think you have provided that context. So how would they have known that she was referring to ketamine and not? Oh, okay. Am I getting that wrong? Anyway, could you clarify? Because wasn't she talking about ketamine in that book?
she was talking about ketamine in the book passage, but I had confirmation that that was used, that same strategy that she was describing there was also used in the phase 3 clinical trials. So I referred to that in the trial as well, but I cited the text because it's the same flawed model of consent and the same reliance on the safe word that was used in the MDMA therapy. And what I said, I think in passing at the beginning, is that ultimately, like, it took me reading all of this Groffian literature, reading about the underground, reading this psychedelic integral therapy book where no one really acknowledged, even though MAPS was all through that book in terms of who wrote it and the people who praised it, there wasn't a lot of acknowledgement about what parts were coming from the MAPS clinical trials. And that's because the MAPS protocol that they were submitting was this kind of euphemistic screen. And there's a big history of this happening where, you know, a lot of people in the MAPS orbit, because they began in a period of intense stigma, they felt like they needed to describe things in a way that ordinary clinicians, doctors would be receptive, the FDA would be receptive to. But if you have that additional context, you know what the euphemisms are referring to. And so a lot of the people, essentially the trials were split. It was like a bifurcation. There was the research centers, the universities. A lot of those people had research backgrounds and did not have an underground background. And then there were the mom and pop private clinics. And Josh Hardman in Psychedelic Alpha, so we haven't seen the complete response letter, but he wrote about someone who had seen it and what they said the letter said. And one of the things that they cited was to do away, so make sure there's an evidence-based therapy that's empirically supported, and change so that you don't have these like small mom and pop, like underground therapy sites, and to have it more in a research setting with that kind of rigorous, you know, training in how to do clinical trials. Because there's an element of like, if you don't have that background in research, you don't know what you don't know about like how to do things right and how to make sure that you're reporting things accurately and that you're attentive to the influence of potential researcher bias affecting the outcomes. And so I think that will be very beneficial if they're actually able to move in that direction. But it's kind of like there was a very neutral way of reading the protocol that most people thought. They read it and they were like, oh, non-directive. That means hands off, you know, just be very empathetic and support whatever's coming up. But if you understand the background of the underground model that is actually the model that informed the clinical trials, you know that non-directive is referring to a completely different idea, which is that in the MDMA state, your ego defenses become porous, like start to become plastic and more malleable. And once your ego defenses are out of the way, your inner healing intelligence will spontaneously start to expel these trauma imprints from your past in the order that is most accessible to consciousness. And so many of these underground trained therapists were trained to attune to what traumas were trying to come out of the clients and to encourage, as a midwife, sometimes to step in with a pillow, like we saw with the phase 2, that was from the protocol. That was not, they would allude in passing to somatic components of, if you're trained in these somatic processes, you can do them, but they wouldn't describe what that entailed in the protocols.
I have a
Can I just
question, actually. Oh, sorry, Andrew, just one sec. So the pillow reminded me of something. So in your testimony for the AdCom, there was, you mentioned this phase 3 trial participant who contacted you, who had worked with Veronica Gold, and there was I guess the text that gave some more details about it, including Gold standing over them with a pillow, I think trying to kick them off. So I asked Gold about this, and she said that never happened. And she also said that Lycos reviewed her videos and confirmed that nothing like that had happened. So I guess my question is, like, is there any way to verify that this participant is recalling things correctly, since the video doesn't actually line up with reality? And I'm also curious if you encourage that participant to report this incident through the proper channels so it could be investigated.
Yeah, so have you seen, are you just, because what I was doing in the AdCom was I was trying to say, I think someone needs to look into this and review the tapes. So I was just saying, this is what people have come to me and told me. I didn't say I knew everything. There are some things that are highly concerning, that are very sensitive, that I have not shared publicly, that I was able to actually see evidence of. And so in my case, I was just relaying, again, serving as a proxy for people who came to me. I did not coach anyone to tell me anything. That was something that was disclosed to me by a participant. And I was making the case that the FDA and, non-Lycos investigators should investigate. And in the recent press release, that's what was one of the things that was included, where Lycos said, we've met with the FDA, and they said one of the things that they might want to see is an independent investigation, which could include things like reviewing the tapes. So I don't have the tapes. I just spoke to people who described their experiences, and I was relaying that as a proxy for people who wanted the FDA to know their experience and didn't feel like they were in a position to be able to say so directly. And so after the FDA made its decision, I was contacted by FDA investigators, and I turned over all of the information I had from my years of research, and I connected them with my sources. So I feel like my role there is done and accomplished. I have not seen the tapes. I don't regret sharing things that people told me. I think that the FDA should consider this and look into it. I think that is a very valid perspective to have.
Sure.
Awesome, thank you. Just shifting gears slightly. So I know Sasha Cisco, who I understand isn't part of Psymposia, but I saw that you had retweeted some of their tweets, that Sasha was successful in getting a few of the papers retracted. I was wondering if you or your colleagues plan to pursue any further retractions?
No, so I'm not involved in kind of advocating for any retractions. We're not involved in that and doing anything more. But I think that should information kind of come about that can make that case, I'm not opposed to doing that. I do think that the way that the sponsor handled the assault, which was associated with that retraction, was very poor. As I said, there was no acknowledgement of the fact that what Jensen was doing on the videotape was Graphian focused body work, which was in the MAPS protocol. There was no acknowledgement of that. And in fact, there were some indications that, Doblin was saying things like Megan was, the phase 2 participant, was ungrateful, was exaggerating and sensationalizing what they had done for her for media attention, and that this was just a relationship. This was not a relationship. This was never a relationship. And the fact that it was described that way for so many years and continues to be described by people associated with MAPS should lead everyone to pause and consider whether the people, in any of those trials that were run by people who thought that what amounts to human trafficking and sex slavery, someone who had to escape, tried to escape multiple times, who was known by MAPS employees, MAPS therapists, associates to be at the location, at the house of these individuals. There is a lot more there that does cast doubt on much of the earlier research and the sponsor's ability to kind of ethically conduct research in this field. So I think it was the right decision. I think that the fact that they were not forthcoming about such an egregious ethical violation is cause to question the rest of the data that was submitted as well, which some people were making the case for. So, but I think that the public has been misled to think that this was a relationship that someone, felt that they fell in love with this therapist, but that's not actually what happened. The actual situation is a lot worse. And I think that needs to be fully grappled with in order for the field to move forward in a healthier way, in a safer way.
Can I just ask a quick question about Psymposia? Because I mean, you guys have obviously done journalism with a cover story, and it seems like you do advocacy work, you do all kinds of different work, and I just wanted to get a general sense. Do you guys have a staff, or how would you describe what Psymposia is as an organization right now? Like, yeah, does it have staff, or does it have a budget, or what is it? What is it?
No, so yeah, we were completely volunteer since I joined in 2018, all the way until this year. We did, because of the success of our, past being, the importance, I would say, of our harm reduction research and advocacy. We have since gotten some donations this year, but prior to that, we had a Patreon, and the money went towards, a website and like Zoom account and stuff like that. So we didn't make any money. The reason we came together is because, like I said, I had been sexually assaulted. I had been bullied out of the mainstream field, in my case by Bill Abate, who I heard there's all kinds of other allegations about. And I was so mistreated. And I was someone who, like, I've been working in this field longer than most people who are in this field. So I've been working in the field since 2010. And I was able to, the fact that I was, able to fly around the world speaking at conferences when I grew up with debilitating obsessive compulsive disorder and, social anxiety and all kinds of issues was a testament to how effective psychedelics could be and how powerful they could be. And so the fact that I was not someone who was supported and lifted up, and instead when I got harmed, I was an acceptable sacrifice because the people who harmed me were powerful and all the rest, that kind of led me to think, like, if this is how the field is acting to me, this doesn't give me a lot of confidence that they are really prioritizing the well-being of the most vulnerable people who are going to be seeking this out. And so we at Psymposia were people who knew each other. We found we were in a minority perspective a lot, that like, hey, there's something here that, like, with the Martin Ball situation, which is how a lot of our so-called negative reputation from many factions in the community came from, is we were saying it's very similar to Veronica Gold. We were saying it's not safe to teach that you can intuit when someone who's not breathing needs to have a tongue stuck down their throat, when someone's genitals need to be touched. That's not safe. It's not safe to teach. Like, it's not safe to do individually, but these were written into textbooks. And so we were making the case that this is not, we need to be doing things differently. And much of the field said we were the problem. We were woke. We were, woke scolds trying to kind of condense psychedelics down into some bureaucratic, boring norm. And that's not at all our orientation. But because so many people wanted that to be the case, they wanted to believe that people do develop spiritual powers that can discern when these things when people need to hurt and need to have those kinds of assaults happen to them. We were very marginalized. And so we found people in the beginning who had like a similar perspective on the premises of like.
Can I just jump right? So who does fund you guys? Where do you guys get funding from?
So we are not currently discussing our funders because I've been getting so many death threats and retaliation that we are concerned for the safety of our funders.
Don't
So,
you, as a 501c3, you have to eventually disclose it, right? I mean, you're going to have to put that in the filing forms, no?
and by that time, there's going to be investigations that have played out, and there's going to be more. Like
Got it.
right now, the situation is like, as someone who went into this, like having a PTSD diagnosis, having been sexually assaulted, trying to get a job for 10 years while I'm being bullied out of the field. I was in this situation, was like, okay, I'm in a good enough place right now to be the proxy, to say, I think this needs to be looked into. And it has been devastating for me. It has been so destabilizing and so harmful and awful that I don't think people who have been on the receiving end of this kind of a campaign of lies and allegations and stochastic kinds of like threats can really understand the psychic toll it can take on you. But having lived through that, given the hostility of the climate that exists right now, I'm just not willing to kind of put people forward to be attacked at a time when the attacks are not
Understood.
playing fair.
Absolutely. Well, I do have one specific question that I was hoping we could just put to rest. That of a group that I don't think has to worry about threats. There are people who wonder if it's the Sarlo Foundation that's helping to foot the bill for your firm, Dominique. Is there anything either of you can say about that?
I'll just kind of stick with the same perspective that I've seen the lengths that the kind of the folks on the moneyed interests on that side have gone to defame and drag people through the mud. And I'm not going to talk about who our funders are in the interest of everyone's safety.
So it's more than one. It's not just one funder. It's yeah.
That's correct. I think
Yeah.
a lot of people are reaching out privately because they see the circus that's been going on with, PSFC, this major funded, it was instrumental to completing the clinical trials, who had identified MAPS as their number one priority for many years, stepping in and mobilizing their network with multiple PR firms and teams, and then directing that and targeting me and representing me as if I am just a anti-veteran extremist who doesn't think that veterans deserve to heal. I spoke to a whistleblower for Purdue Pharma from 20 years ago, and he was describing what Purdue put him through, and it was the same playbook. He was a anti-patient extremist who didn't want people to heal. Had threats. He had to move his house because of it. This is the pharma interest industry playbook that goes after people who are speaking up for individuals, for vulnerable people, in part like people like me who have had lived experience with the harms and understand how awful it can be when it goes wrong. And seeing the patterns that there are people who feel like because the MAPS therapy, they encourage therapists to look, the ethical guardrails is check in with yourself, do the work, make sure you're coming from a good place and have good intentions, and use that to intuit what the other person needs. And that is so vulnerable to bias and projection. And then when the client says, that's not what I wanted, that was not okay with me, then they say, oh, you had vulnerability hangover. I knew what you wanted at the time because I checked in with myself, and that wasn't it. So you must be mired in mental illness and kind of unable to take responsibility for the fact that that's what you needed at the time. So seeing those patterns and speaking up and being tremendously brave and courageous, honestly, to take a bullet for other people who said, I feel like I need to say something and I feel like I can't. What do I do? And the fact that so much of the field has been intimidated, because that's what happens. That's what's going on with the trucks at college campuses, where they put people's names and pictures and addresses. They're trying to signal to intimidate not just the people who did speak up, but to intimidate other people, that this is what will happen if you rock the boat, if you question what it is that we're doing here, we will make an example of you too. And so a lot of people reach out to us privately and say, we are so grateful for what you've done. We support you. We want to be behind you.
I had just one more question I wanted to ask,
Yeah.
but Andrew, please go
Yeah.
forward.
Do you mind? It's just because I'm trying to like wrap my head around sort of this issue about the therapy and the harms. And I know the touch issue is a big thing, just any touch or inappropriate touching. And it would seem to me that the evidence of this kind of behavior in the MAPS trials was very limited, right? It wasn't like, as far as we know, there was that one example on video, but given that there aren't, it doesn't seem to be a systematic thing versus the kind of benefits of psychedelics that could help the veterans, for example. I know, yeah, PTSD.
I'd be happy to share. And I think there's a misunderstanding between the difference between systematic and systemic. Systemic critique is kind of what I've been looking at, which is something that is arising because of the premises of how this is happening. It does not need to mean that it's happening to everyone or across the board. It's not like in every instance of the therapy. But because this therapy model is associated with this particular pattern of harms in the underground, and I can explain through my research how the premises of the model are leading to those outcomes in a way that is unjustified and unsupportable. And then those same premises are being brought into this clinical trial context. And there have been some instances that we do know of where these same harms are playing out. And then when you combine that with what we know from other contexts, like in my most recent Substack, I talk about Vipassana meditation, which has a similar sort of trust the process, trust that whatever is coming up is coming out up for healing. The way out is through. There was a really excellent podcast series called The Retreat that looked at the people who are left behind by that approach, who are conditioned that they're told that they need to push themselves to endure the suffering if things are getting bad. And what that podcast said is that there is a predictable pattern of people who are ending up getting their nervous systems completely dysregulated, leading to suicide. And there's no kind of support network to catch the nuance for when people actually aren't getting better by taking more MDMA, by pushing themselves into distress. And so that premise that trust that whatever is coming up for healing and the way out is through, and to view suicidality as part of the process and to kind of embrace it, that model we already know from other contexts leads to patterns of harm that when you scale this out to people who don't have resources, it's going to cause problems. And there was a PSFC gave a talk on psychedelic philanthropy recently, where Michael Cotton, who is advocating for psychedelic therapy for the most marginalized, vulnerable people in society, he acknowledges that he went to a retreat and it was extremely destabilizing for him. And it took like months for him to go with integration and put the pieces back together. And that's for someone who is very wealthy. And so to see all these connections and to be able to point to analogous examples where just saying, trust the process, whatever comes up is coming up for healing and the way out is through, and seeing how that goes wrong in meditation contexts. I know enough to know that this is not a safe way to proceed with psychedelic therapy, and there are better ways. We don't need to just assume that what was done in the underground, where there was no external vetting or outsider perspectives and addressing of blind spots, that's just the way this works because it's what was done. That's not how science works. Science works by bringing multiple stakeholder perspectives to the table and thinking about how things can go wrong for the least powerful, the most vulnerable people in society. That's what bioethics is for. It's not about good intentions. It's about thinking through the implications of our systems and what we're developing, and really standing up and being willing to say, we need to get this right.
Thank you so much for that additional context. Just one very last question before we let you go. There's been a lot of speculation about the departure of David Nichols and Lily K. Ross, and they've put forth their own accusations of unethical behavior within the Psymposia team, but haven't provided any details. Is there anything that you can share about their departure and the reasons behind it?
Yeah, so I mean, contrary to their claims, we fully investigated all complaints, allegations, and found they were completely without merit. Since the specifics of what happened with them involve sources, We are not going to go into the details of it because of to protect our sources' privacy, but they're false and without merit.
Okay.
I will say this is great for now. Yeah, we'll just be in touch by email. Timing, I think we're all sort of waiting for the election to see what life is like after that before anyone's going to care to read about anything else but the election. So yeah, I think my hope is in the next 2 weeks to be done with this. Yeah, the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
love that too.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, if one of you could shoot us a copy of the video so we can just have it for transcription purposes, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and upload that for you.
Lovely. Thank you.